This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to a new podcast called Justice Worriers, which is a name that works really well when it's written down and doesn't work very well when you say it, it turns out. But yeah, warriors spelled as in people who worry about things. My name is Andy. I'm joined by Leah and Jörg. Say hello, Leah.
Hello, hi there.
And say hello, Jörg.
Hi there.
We are people who go to St John's Church in Egham.
And we found ourselves having conversations about justice and how important justice is, possibly even re-evaluating our whole faith in the light of that realisation.
Does that sound something like what we talked about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, a process over the last kind of... I say more for me, it's knowing that justice issues were always part of being a Christian, but not really being able to fit them into the way I thought about the Bible. That's been the bigger change for me.
Right.
So not so much waking up to them, but marrying those two things together.
Okay. What about you, Jörg?
Well, on top of that, I think also how to put these things in action. So you can talk all about this. You think about this. I tend to think about these things a lot, but how do you bring a congregation around when it often seems that we're still just thinking about personal salvation all the time?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, we're quite an individualistic society, and so one of the things that I feel like I've been waking up to is that the Bible talks about this stuff loads more than I realised, or maybe I did realise, but somehow I don't know, I feel more woken up to it. But it talks about it often in corporate terms, not in individual terms, and that doesn't fit well with the way we often think about things.
Okay, just explain a bit more what you mean by that. Corporate terms.
So, I feel like the big things that are wrong in our society are things that are being done by the whole of society to certain groups within the society rather than by individuals. You know, it's oppression of whole groups of people by the whole system of the whole society.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that fits really well with the fact that the Bible is often talking in those terms about how a whole society is operating. And it doesn't fit very well with the way we often view our lives in our culture generally, and in church culture as well.
Yeah. So we get very hung up about my actions as an individual and how they affect other individuals. We don't spend a lot of time talking about my actions as part of a wider culture or part of a wider political system or economic system, and how those actions then affect a broader group of another culture or another part of the world. Or is that the kind of thing you're saying?
Yeah, and I think we're... Go on, Jörg.
Yeah, but there's also this other sort of more vague systemic justice that then comes in through the church. So if you think about the, Bishop Welby falling down before the monument of the 1919 massacre this week and apologizing in the name of Christ. And you think, well, actually, there's a lot more concrete stuff that needs to be talked about here. You know, this is a very important symbolic act that happened, but it has not a lot to do with these issues with justice as we're thinking about them.
Right. It doesn't change current issues of injustice that are going on right now, you mean?
Well, it doesn't really say what happened either. It's like, you know,
right.
so it's a symbolic enactment of justice, but it's not specific enough to, you know, we could talk about today's colonialism, we could talk about colonial pasts, but yeah, here he is apologizing in the name of Christ, who actually didn't do anything there.
Is that actually what he said?
Yes, yeah, he did. But
Okay.
he couldn't apologize on behalf of the British Empire, of course, because he's not a statesperson. But then you think, like, okay, what's the church for? Like, what are the conversations we do want to have around this?
Right. Yeah, and so something that's been in my mind recently is how can we, as a local church, as a national and international church, should we be involved with politics? And I feel like we should. We should be trying to change some of the things that are wrong in the world. But I also feel quite cautious about linking the church with politics, because I know there's a lot of downsides to that.
Yeah. Well, I think if you differentiate between engaging in politics and being political, there is a narrow pathway there. You have to work it out in between, but there's nothing wrong with talking about the injustice in this world as long as you don't adopt a party for your solutions.
So what would be an example of that?
Well, you could talk about poverty in England, for example, and how people struggle and suffer without necessarily blaming a certain party for it directly. It is about shining a light on these things and then shining the light of Christ on it and say, well, how do we learn to care for one another? What does it say about our society? And put the pressure on politicians to find proper solutions for it in that way. So I don't think the church is called to enact these solutions of justice necessarily when it is things, and it's something we have to talk about, like where does the church fit in with our idea of secular laws, secular ethics. But what the church shouldn't do is then withdraw from that realm of actually pointing a light on these things that are going wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's been the problem for quite some time, hasn't it? That the church has been aware that it's been too involved in being part of the state, and so it's kind of rowed back. But you could argue it's rowed back too much.
So that brings me on to something that I've noticed about when Jesus talks about stuff, or when he acted in ways that are kind of justice issues. It seems to me, looking at it now, that he always acted in situations where there was a power imbalance, and he was always on the side of the powerless or the less powerful. And yeah, then we have this weird situation in the UK where the church was part of the power base of the state, and in some symbolic ways still is, but probably less so in reality. So that does make it complicated.
Well, we as Christians too, not just the church, we as Christians are part of the power base, and that's part of the problem of going to church on a Sunday or doing a podcast like this, and then the next day, being a cog in a system that we don't always agree with.
Yeah, or even by doing this, we could be a cog in a system that makes things worse.
Yeah.
Great, good start to the podcast.
Good start.
So we had a conversation about what we were going to talk about in this episode, and we spent most of that conversation talking about reasons why Christians should have nothing to say about justice.
Nice segue, I like it.
And why this whole thing is a terrible idea. So do we want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we just did. Yeah, I think it comes back to what we have just said, that the church has historically been as much part of the problem as it's been part of the solution. And if you approach the average person on the street, that would almost certainly be their first reaction. And where they can point to things that the church has done for the social good, they would probably be right back where we started the conversation, pointing at things that the church has done for the good of individuals. So what you would call social action rather than social justice. So that, if they thought hard about it, they'd be able to think about soup kitchens and homeless projects and that kind of legacy. But other than, I guess, bringing up the abolition of the slave trade, which is always brought up, and I know we've all got some views on it, it will probably come out in a later podcast. People don't generally come up with things that the church has done to fight against an overall system. So the church is seen more as part of the problem.
So when you say part of the problem, what is the problem? What do you mean by that?
The power imbalances. I would say that the church is too often on the side of the powerful and should be on the side of the dispossessed, but it's not easy to pick that strain up through history. It's there, but it's not the first thing that will spring to people's minds.
Well, I mean, my question here is, on the one hand, you have the problem with the church. How good is the church in being justice? But there's an even more fundamental question for me: is there something specifically Christian about justice? And when we say that, what do we mean by that? Like, do other religions just have it mostly figured out, but just not as well as we do? Should we claim justice for Christianity, or isn't secular justice actually a good balance? Those kind of questions also. What are we doing in this podcast when we're talking about justice from a Christian perspective.
But I find that hard because I have never really studied the teachings of Hinduism or Islam or other religions other than kind of what I might hear in conversation or the media. So I'm only equipped to talk about what Christians believe about social justice issues and have probably a reasonable idea about what secular humanists might argue for, but the other religions are outside of what I know, and I feel I would be characterizing them wrongly.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying we should be doing comparative justice. The question is just what do we mean by a Christian view of justice? Do we expect that to be different from others, or is it actually just our normal ideas about ethics, how we were brought up, being projected onto Christianity? So what is it specifically that we're expecting to get out of the Bible or out of our own religion that will guide our approaches to justice that we know is not informed by culture, other things like that?
Yeah, I think from a personal point of view, part of my experience over the last few years has been of a linking of Christianity with my ideas about justice. So so I guess I'm saying there might be other people in the same boat. Over the last few years, I feel like my understanding of my faith has changed a lot, and what happened as part of that was thinking about what's really important, and feeling that the message about justice and acting rightly was the thing that remained or became the clearest thing to me when other things fell away or felt difficult to understand. So anyway, what I'm saying is my experience has been that my thinking about justice in myself has been intimately linked with the fact that I'm a Christian. It doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of thinking about justice, but it means that experience is what I'm trying to talk about here, I guess. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I think that works for me. Because as I was thinking about our theme of the podcast today, it just occurred to me, like, to think about what I don't want this podcast to be. There can be a sense in which we say, okay, here's our faith, and it gives us all the answers on justice, and then you end up pontificating. You kind of say, well, this is how it should be, and from the Bible we learn it should be this and this. When what I find fascinating is how the Bible itself sometimes struggles with the idea of justice, and I would like us to be able to unpack a lot of these struggles in the Bible too, through the topics that we're talking about. Because for me, what the church can do is it can be that place in the village or in the small town or whatever we want to call Egham, where people know this is where we think about these kind of questions. Outside of the pub, there's another place where you can go and just kind of talk about life and think about what's fair, what's not fair. So how do we get away from seeing our goal as something, where we instruct other people how justice is done and we find the answers, to let's have a conversation, let's figure this out, let's have the space where nobody has time or the energy to talk about these things, to grapple with the difficult things, to bring in voices that are not normally heard. That to me has a lot more to do with justice, the grappling with injustice, than finding answers to this or that problem.
And hopefully that's somewhere where using some kind of thing like the Bible is a helpful tool, because as you said, the Bible will bring up awkward questions and help us to avoiding them.
Absolutely. Think about the story of the flood, for example. I started thinking about this today, like God just kind of, the story is like, okay, we're wiping out all of humanity because they were terrible. And then in the end, he's like, well, let me give you a rainbow. Just promise that I'm never going to do that again. So you think, what's going on here? It's almost as if God feels sorry for what he's done. And then we see a different kind of justice emerging from that. There's laws and all of that. So the Bible itself is telling us a story of, this almost sounds a little bit too much, but almost like God is learning about justice himself. I don't want to push this point too far, but in our discovery of God, we are never done, and there's new forms of justice that emerge. There's new questions that each form of justice throws up, and that to me is what this is about.
And I think that's something that I've certainly, and I think perhaps you, with conversation with Andy particularly, have experienced in our faith in general recently, has been that we know we don't have all the answers, and that process of grappling with the questions has been invaluable, and to sort of, we haven't come out of that and then suddenly reached a plateau where we've got all the answers, and that, hey, well, actually talking about social justice is really important, and now we know how to do it, and we're sorry we kind of ignored it before, and we're not saying we've reached somewhere. It is, as you say, it's still dealing with those questions and working out how to be Bible-based believers, and deal with a God who rains on everyone incessantly and drowns them.
Yeah.
Or when he's queried about his justice, kind of says, story of Job. I don't know, where were you when I created all of this?
Yeah.
Do you know how this?
Could you do a better job?
Those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. The justified, those that died, they're the chosen whites.
Yeah, so hopefully that's why the title of the podcast makes some sense, because it almost could be called sort of Justice Bumblers or something like that. But the pun was too delicious to avoid.
Does the pun work better with Jörg's accent? I was wondering. Can you give it a try, Jörg? Justice Worriers?
Justice Warriors? Warriors?
No, do it
doesn't.
in your proper accent.
I don't know what that is anymore. Justice Warriors. Do you want a German accent? Do you want German?
Yeah,
American?
try it with a German accent.
Justice Warriors.
Yeah, it still sounds like it
Justice
could
Warriors.
be warrior or warrior.
Yeah, it doesn't really.
Yeah, it's a perfect pun. It's impossible to differentiate between the two words
Okay.
using sound. But that's okay, because most people find their podcasts on the internet, so hopefully they'll understand that we're not claiming something that we're not.
Yeah.
We're very much claiming more the moniker of people who worry about justice than
Yeah, I
people
think
who
we should
fight.
subtitle it Bumblers.
Bumblers.
Justice Bumblers. We'll bring that up later, because I've got an activity for later.
Okay.
So I feel like we can't get too far into this podcast without addressing the fact that I feel like we as a church have really failed on a number of things that I would put under the term justice over the long term and over the short term, including recently covering up of abuse scandals that's happened in various different churches, and the sort of, that's such a stark power imbalance situation where people are trusted by a whole community and abuse that trust, and then when it's known that they've done that, they're then protected and it's hidden and allowed to happen somewhere else. It's so utterly the opposite of what we're talking about. I don't have anything to say about that.
There is. I think it's important to acknowledge, and there isn't anything else you can say, really, is there? But it needs to be out there and acknowledged.
So maybe an honest conversation about what justice is and what power imbalances exist can be part of us as a whole massive group of people starting to do better and heal and avoid something like that happening again, or make it less likely.
Yeah, and I think that kind of helps guard against what Jörg was describing before, of kind of feeling that we're suddenly here to tell people or instruct people, or the church needs to kind of come out and start telling people how to behave justly. I think when you bear with humility the great injustices done by the church, that guards you against being that kind of strident, telling people what to do. It should, and it can, can't it? If we keep that awareness with us and hold that, it's a good counterpoint to that feeling to want to be able to tell people what to do.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a place for telling the church what to do and saying you should be more concerned about justice issues than you are? Or is that also preaching?
No, I think that's a constant problem, isn't it? I mean, we're following a leader in Jesus Christ who always did that, who always pointed the fingers. He never went to the temple and said, "Oh, this is great, this is fun." I mean, he always had sort of this challenge to hang out in front of people, and he was fairly short on solutions, if you notice. You know, like in terms of saying this is how you should live. It was very aspirational. It was, orient yourself in that way, seek the kingdom of God. All this, very idealistic stuff, we would say. That's what he hung out in front of people, rather than say, well, give this or that. And when he was asked about specifics, he said, no, like, look to the heart. What is it that you actually want? So this drive to say, whenever we feel like we got things figured out, or we're thinking about, what are the rules by which we should do this or that or administer justice, we should actually challenge ourselves to say, no, wait a minute, we're already losing the plot. What is it that's driving us? What's in our hearts? Why? We talk about the abuse scandal, for example, and we all feel touched in a way, but do we sit down and weep? We don't. Why not? What is it about those stories that haven't really sunk in us? Like, there's always this drive to push us deeper into the injustice of this world and to make that cry out to God. Like your prayer sometimes, Andy, like in the church, you take us along and really push us to pay attention to what's going on in the Congo or wherever, and to make it our own worries.
Right.
I think if I'm speaking personally, one of the journeys that I've been on in the past few years is that I've learnt to hold these things without anger at my fellow Christians.
Right.
And because that's destructive and unhelpful and creates a group of kind of almost like martyrish people within the church who go, well, if you lot were only just paying attention to climate change, whatever. That's something that God's definitely changed in me, in my attitude, and humility comes with that, doesn't it? That we're all justice worrying our way to try and get this stuff right, and can we bring more people within the church along on that journey? I really hope so, but we can't do that from a place of anger and annoyance at people, because it's counterproductive. It doesn't achieve anything. It doesn't help us either.
Well, then there's this other aspect that we also worry about ourselves, don't we? And that can be, it can really drag you down in a way too, when you think about your own position.
Yeah.
How we all benefit from a system. We live in fairly affluent Surrey, and we're not living in gated communities or anything, but we're part of a society that lets all of these inequalities exist, and yet we're so unable to change them. We pay taxes into a system, that sometimes drops bombs on people that we deeply disagree with, and so you get to this place where we think about our own positionality in this, and the worry I have here is that it can also become a bit of a preoccupation. You kind of drag yourself down. How do you find freedom from that, and find sort of an exciting drive toward justice rather than just highlighting the injustice, the problems all the time?
Yeah. So I like the idea that, like, we accept that we're inside this we're members of this thing that's unjust, and that's how we avoid feeling angry at someone else, because it's us that we're talking to. And I like the idea that we're not preaching, but we are sometimes maybe sort of screaming out in pain on behalf of the oppressed, right? And that can be a valid form of conversational persuasion.
Yeah, and I think our crying and our screaming is more often that kind of, as in the Psalms, kind of dialogue with God, and we can wrestle those things with God and then find a way to then bring them to other people in a way that is encouraging and inspiring, and not obviously screaming at them.
Yeah, I mean, screaming out to God is totally biblical, right? Like, why have you allowed this to happen?
It's in there a few times, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think also the issue of guilt is a big thing for me. definitely I've spent a lot of my life feeling guilty every time I bought a coffee out, because it's clearly a totally superfluous purchase and there's people starving. And that's not actually a really very helpful way to live your life. So trying to find that line between thoughtfulness and consideration of those who don't have as much as we do, but without then living a life that loses so much of its joy because it's feeling guilty every time you do kind of, something frivolous and fun.
Well, yeah, and it's are we Injustice Worriers or are we Justice Worriers? So again, the question is, what's the forward-looking bit to this, right? So, when you have an idea, or when you really connect with somebody, and that really drives you, right? So I can be in Ethiopia and have the best conversation with people, where I don't worry about the injustice. They're there, I'm aware of it, but all of a sudden we're celebrating something else. And how do we find that? Like with people that we maybe even don't like, or where we see that people aren't really integrating community, we want to make them feel welcome. How do we get to that place where justice is sort of a vision that drives us toward people rather than away from ourselves or other people?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot in a biblical view of justice, which is all tied up with righteousness and right relationships. So it's about making sure that we are all able to flourish, and what can the relationships that we have with people do to enable that. It's not just about being constantly fixated about what we're buying or not buying. It's a much bigger thing than that, isn't it? And then obviously relationships, if they're any good, are full of joy and laughter, celebration, friendship.
This is all just making me feel really guilty about how inclusive our church is of people who come in from the outside who are different in some way from...
You personally feeling guilty?
Me personally, yeah.
Is that because you don't get to speak to all of them? Or
is that because what, sorry?
Is that because you feel you need to personally welcome them all and you don't do it?
Yeah, maybe.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
Isn't that part of the problem when we think about talking about justice and talking to a church about justice? How do you avoid that people go like, oh, it's that topic again. All right, I'm here. I'm going to feel guilty again, or I'm not doing this or that. And I think that's what the ultimate point is about Jesus' parables about the kingdom. He's telling us something exciting. He's trying to paint a vision of a different way, of a different society. And that's why he gets a bit radical sometimes, right? So that's why he seems to say, well, if somebody forces you to go a mile, go the extra mile. Just go out beyond that. Try and reach a different place. And how do we capture that? How do we sort of find a creative way about talking about injustices and turn them into a vision for justice, into a vision for a different kind of society, for a different kind of way of solving this problem? That to me would be really exciting if we could manage that somehow.
It's really exciting. That reminds me of something. I was listening to the sermon at St John's Church on Sunday, and our vicar Esther was talking about offering yourself as a living sacrifice, but she was emphasising the fact that it says offer your body as a living sacrifice. She was talking, I think, about how that's a challenge to her because it's like a really big thing, like giving up control of your body. To me, I found it really encouraging because your body is quite limited and you don't have infinite capacity. So I think sometimes when I hear Jesus saying, go the extra mile, I kind of hear, go on forever and never stop. And and he didn't. He just said, do something outrageously generous, right? He didn't say do something infinitely generous that destroys your body. So by saying offering your body as a sacrifice, my point is, but that's within the capacity of my body. It's not something impossible.
It's finding that subversive that subversive stance, that subversive approach to it, right? So going the extra mile is turning the oppression around. Yeah. And if you think about the movements that really inspired us toward justice, the civil rights movement, the decolonizing movements in India and elsewhere, or South Africa, my own home, East Germany, that was always like when you don't quite play by the rules, suddenly something changes, and that's when it gets really exciting. And it's somehow harnessing that vision for justice that would be really cool.
Yeah, and I think outside of the church, but Christians are definitely involved. The whole Extinction Rebellion thing, for me, is a really good example of that. You've seen that, taking a party out onto the streets. People were there, and they looked like they were having a pretty good time to me. They were making a statement, but they were enjoying it. And yes, it's back to that same lineage as you just said.
Yeah, I feel like we can have at least a whole podcast about breaking the rules. So we shouldn't go too far onto breaking the rules now, because that's a really interesting thing. But yeah, it's cool. Cool. I'm wondering what else we want to say that introduces... The point of this episode is to introduce the listener to the kind of conversation we're going to have and why we're doing this. Something else I definitely wanted to mention was that I feel like as people who live in a country where we're free and our government has influence, and we are the kind of people that people in our government listen to, probably. I wanted to point out that we have power, not just the three of us, but people in a church like St. John's, people, many of the people who might listen to this, are people who have power and I think haven't been using it, or haven't been using it as much as we could. And I feel like if we get together and decide this stuff is important, we can influence people like our government. So that's part of the reason why I want to do this.
Yeah, if I can be a bit provocative, I sometimes wonder how much of that power that we think we have is an illusion as well. We're giving certain confined spaces in which we can play, but don't ask anything too radical. I grew up in East Germany, and it's a different scale, but it's the same idea, right? You had your private area. You could say anything you wanted as long as you could be certain there's nobody from the Stasi there. That was fine. And then you learn to play by the rules elsewhere. What do? We kind of do the same way. We have a lot more ways of expressing ourselves in the public sphere, but it's still a confined area. This is how you do it. As long as you go to work and you do what you need to do, and as long as you protest in this way, and this is why Extinction Rebellion, was able to subvert the rules somewhat. So I also want us to think about the empower of fighting for justice. So what are the limitations that we encounter, and how can we find ways around that, perhaps?
That's really interesting.
I mean, I'm not a revolutionary, I should say. I lived in a revolutionary state. I don't really like the idea of it, but how do we subvert the spaces we're given?
Yeah, what rules should we be breaking as a podcast and as in our lives generally? It's an interesting question.
But I think there is a sense in which we need to learn to inhabit the space that we have, perhaps, before we're not even doing the things that we can do within the confines that are acceptable currently as a church as a whole.
That's a very fair challenge.
So I think my only concern about feeling that we have power is that very often the best kind of the best kind of revolutions come from the margins, and we are definitely not on the margins. And for those on the podcast, we are all white. I am female. They are both white males. We need to make sure, and I think actually, on the Extinction Rebellion thing, this was an interesting thing that I know they got put to them, and that they have since dialogued about, that they were predominantly white and middle class and able to take some of the actions that they were able to take because they are not people who are used to or likely to be hassled by forces of law and order. So is that kind of we can do this and we're doing it on behalf of other people, or are we just then co-opting them in our ideas and our struggle? So I think Yes, we have perhaps more power than some other people in our society, but we do need to be really careful how we tell the stories of marginalised people and co-opt perhaps those stories. What I mean is how we don't do that. Make sure that we don't co-opt those voices and find ways to enable other people to take up their power that they found harder to take up than we have. Does that make sense?
No, but
Yeah,
I
if
think
we
that's
can
a good point.
amplify voices. We do get to use... There are certain types of power that we have, like, for example, just being less likely to be arrested than someone who looks different, that we can use. But I totally agree. How we use it is a really important question. We've got to use it to get out of the way of people whose voices need to be heard.
Yeah.
Well, and bring people into this podcast,
Create a
hopefully,
space.
instead of representing them or discussing about them, talking about them, let people talk and let us find the questions. Some of the issues that we may be grappling with in this podcast are not ones that we have ourselves experienced. So how do we even claim that we can speak for the situation, understand the question? Yeah, so that I hope we get to do some of that, to actually bring in people to tell us about justice.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be ignorant and confused on this podcast.
Yeah, and I think that humility that says that we're actually in an enviable position that we can pick which issues we choose to care about. Yeah, so we could ignore all these issues and our lives would kind of, carry on okay. Whereas there are plenty of people for whom these issues are, if not life or death, they are an actual obstruction to them being able to lead a what we call a decent life, and we should not forget that.
Yeah, so if you're shouting at your electronic device about us, please send us an email and tell us who we should be shutting up and listening to. We would really like to have people on whose voices we haven't heard, who are going to challenge us and make us uncomfortable. We're going to do our best to do that, but we need your help as well, because the nature of ignorance is that we don't know
What we don't know.
what we don't know.
And what questions we want to be discussing as well. I mean, we made a list of ideas, but what is it that is really burning on other people's hearts?
Absolutely. Yeah, if you are listening, do get in touch. We would love to know that you're listening and to hear from you your thoughts. We are very aware of what a narrow view we're going to have. We're going to try and widen it by bringing other people in. We really want to hear from you. So that's some idea of what this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be us wrestling with how we respond to injustice and how we have that positive vision of justice and crazy radical things that we can do that are exciting and fun and show some of the show like the kind of stuff Jesus talked about is what I'm trying to say. So I had one activity that I need you to help with, although I think probably we should let listeners help us as well, which is that on some podcasts the podcasters have a name for their listeners. So like Adam Buxton has the best one, which he calls his listeners the Podcats, which is just the best name ever because he's a funny person. The Brexit casters call their listeners Brexit casters, which is very confusing.
Yeah, that's not so good.
What do you think we should call our listeners? We could call them the Bumblers.
I was just thinking that.
Maybe.
Isn't the plural already assuming something?
Yeah, but then they just sound like bees.
Yeah.
The Bumble.
Bumble.
Yeah, the Bumble.
Yeah.
So listeners or listener, if there are any, get in touch and let us know what we should call you. And the other thing I'd like to do in each episode is try and have like a positive thing that we challenge either our listeners or ourselves to do. and I was thinking that each time one of the hosts should agree to do this thing. Although obviously I haven't got any agreement for this, so maybe it won't happen. But so I have an idea of a possible action that I could suggest. Something that I've already done, so I don't have to do it. Which is I've found a podcast which has made a big difference to some of my thinking about this stuff. Which is a podcast called The Bible Project, and they talk through different biblical books and different themes, and just explain what they think the Bible is saying, and a lot of the way they've explained things has really helped me to understand how the theme of justice and the power difference between people is sort of threaded through so much of the Bible. I found it incredibly challenging and inspiring. So my suggested action is to listen to a podcast by the Bible Project, possibly the one about, I want to say, Luke, in which they talk a lot about how that is kind of the social justice gospel, or really any of them, because they're all amazing.
Yeah, or I would say the recent series on generosity, it really chimes in with some of the things we've been talking about. So it's like a four podcasts long, but start with the first one.
Well, I wasn't as good. I only watched one on justice, but that one sort of came full circle. It was almost too clean in the end, but it's still good to look at. It explains everything in 5 minutes. Very good.
Was that one of their YouTube videos?
Yeah, the one with the cork world where people push things up and down, but it just it's sort of a run through biblical idea of justice, what we mean by justice. But like I said, I wasn't. Yeah, it left me with no questions in the end, and that's never a good thing.
Right. Yeah. I would say their YouTube videos are good, but their podcasts are much more likely to leave you with questions.
Good.
So I'd recommend the podcast. So there's your action, listener, if you'd like to take it. Jörg, are you gonna take it then? Are you gonna listen to our podcast?
Well, I should do my homework.
It's fine. He doesn't need to get out of his chair for that one.
Yeah. We're going to have much harder actions in future podcasts.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Well, if you think this podcast seems like the kind of thing you'd like to listen to, subscribe to it in wherever you get podcasts. Please tell your friends. Please leave a rating if you like it. Don't leave a rating if you don't like it. And at some point I'll add on to this recording details about website and stuff like that when we've sorted it out.
Maybe we should do an episode about ratings and perceptions and
Yeah, good one.
Yeah.
the rating economy.
Yeah, we should. But in the meantime, don't let that put you off giving us a rating, listener, because that's the way people find stuff.
That's
That's
right.
the system, eh?
That's the system, yeah.
It's the
that's
system we live in it. Cool. Well, thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Jörg. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Andy.
Cheers. Take care. Bye now.
Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Worriers. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Worriers, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
And now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.